internet, and welcome to No Bodies, the horror content podcast where we clean up the ugly things so you don't have to.
Our bi-weekly show features two hosts and rotating guest content experts tackling the nitty-gritty complex horror topics with the hope of making the genre more approachable for frequent flyers and newbies alike.
The goal of this show is to highlight diverse voices and perspectives in horror. This is your reminder that there may be discourse on this show that will challenge the way you look at the genre. So let's get ready to get ugly. I'm the ghost with the blog and your friendly neighborhood femme rage apologist, Lonely, and I'm joined by my co-host and partner in crime.
I'm Suzie, or you know me as Projectile Varmint, but lately I feel like I'm a canine and human excrement picker-upper. I've picked up so much shit today that I feel like it was a perfect activity to lead us into tonight's topic.
Well, I hope it's the topic and not the guest, because that would
I'll let you know afterwards.
I've recently become a dog mom, as nauseatingly horrible it is to say that. And you don't realize how much these little demons take up your life. Like, we got her and I'm like, oh, sweet angel baby. We named her Sage because I thought she was going to bring all this peace into our life. And she's a demon spawn from hell.
As long as you don't put the dog mom sticker on your car.
Oof, never. Okay. Never. I do have fuzzy dice and a fuzzy steering wheel cover, but that might be exposing too much already. So in terms of exposing too much and just bringing everybody in our circle, we do have a bit of a family reunion tonight on No Bodies. We have lots of special guests on the show, but tonight we bring you one of the most special. And if you can't tell, I am totally copying an intro that he did for me the last time we recorded, and it's not sucking up if it's a direct quote. So according to my deep dive of subreddit research, he has been involved with producing around 10 podcasts. And for the sake of his pride, I wasn't going to include how long he's been podcasting, but he added it to his bio. So he is a true movie critic and a podcasting veteran with over 10 years of experience in this little community. And though I cannot do the trademark intro voice, it is still my pleasure to welcome that one friend who never texts you back, the host of Horror Movie Weekly and Jay of the Dead's new horror movies, Jay of the Dead.
Hey, thank you. Thanks for having me. I'm so excited to be here. Seriously, I am so pumped. I listened to the first episode and I loved it because as we're recording this thus far, only episode 1 is released, and I am very impressed and so proud to be a guest. Thank you for inviting me.
And Jay said he was under the weather today, so we're going to take it a little bit easier on him than we'd planned. You are all over the podcasting scene, and maybe that's why you've been coined the pod father, but I like to refer to you as my pod daddy. I told you I'd make you blush. This is the man that got me into podcasting. I was just a commenter on Horror Movie Podcast. And then Jay asked me to hop onto Horror Movie Weekly. And he even made me, I think, do an interview, if I recall. My first podcast with him, I was using some crappy Beats headphones and my internal microphone. Look where I am now. No longer a noob. So thank you, Jay.
Absolutely. Yeah, you were born to do this, Suzie, in my opinion. I think you're a great podcaster.
And you also gave, I think, Lonely her first taste as well.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, I'm like a
very spoiled.
I'm like a drug dealer out here.
The first one's free.
Yeah, that's right. Honestly, and it is too. I mean, it is a bug that will bite you, and it's so addictive, and it's hard to stop too.
I know, you just can't. I mean, what's up with movie podcast weekly, monthly, yearly? Is that still going on?
Yeah, I have so many stupidly similar named shows. It's ridiculous. But yes, we still have that show too. Yes. My Achilles heel.
To your brand.
My Achilles heel is releasing. I'm telling you, I'm just terrible at that. So I'm going to follow your
You're
example.
Terrible at releasing?
Yeah, releasing podcast episodes. Yes.
Oh, God.
You in your bathroom.
Your parents flirt. It's gross.
Well, we're doing an episode on exploitation, so just getting us in the mood.
All right, well, let's keep it moving here. But the last little spiel we'll do about Jay, and then we'll stop talking about Jay and start talking about everything else. But the reason why we kind of roped Jay into this tonight is he has probably seen more movies than any of us put together, so that's why he's here. But I do want to give him a little thank you. I am old-fashioned in a lot of ways, and one of those is that I still believe very firmly in thank you notes. So I have sent Jay a thank you note every time I've been on Horror Movie Weekly. Suzie, I don't even think you know this, but
You nerd.
I am a nerd. I also work in workforce development, so thank you notes are like real important. But anyway.
Oh, classy. Seriously. Classy.
So now I'm just doing a verbal thank you for the role that he played in making No Bodies happen. So Suzie and I had this vision for a show that we wanted to do. We were sitting in a restaurant with this wild idea, and we're like, how the hell are we going to make this happen? And the first name that came up was obviously Jay. We're like, well, we have an expert in-house. Let's just see if we can convince him to share the state secrets. And he was a huge supporter in answering questions, being a great resource, and for a little baby content creator like me, a major mentor in the last month as we got up and running. So thank you, Jay.
Absolutely, my pleasure, and I'm so excited that this show exists. In fact, if I may slip this in here, if you don't mind, upon listening to episode 1, your debut about mental health in the horror genre, if you haven't already, I was going to recommend you connecting with Andred the Blind. That's his horror name, Andred. He's the host of a show called Freaks and Psychos, the Disability and Horror podcast. So he actually examines how those with disabilities are portrayed and depicted in horror movies, and it's a really cool show. And as soon as I heard your first episode, I'm like, oh, they should talk. This is going to be great.
Definitely. I have that written down. So, Suzie, we can definitely circle back on that. So now that we have made Jay feel really great about himself, I hope you're ready to fight for your life, because the next hour of this recording is going to get ugly in a lot of ways. Mm-hmm. And that's because we're going to be unpacking extreme horror and diving into the ethics of creating and consuming extreme content. And we originally had Jay slotted in for a different episode, but this conversation actually came out of our last conversation on Horror Movie Weekly, and we just couldn't let it go. So before we get too deep into this conversation, I do just want to give a disclaimer for our listeners, especially those who may be younger. We aren't going to be regaling you on every gritty detail of these films, especially the ones we mentioned, but I would really encourage you to do your own research on any of the media talked about in this episode before diving in, because there's some of this stuff that I feel I would have just been better off never consuming. So do your research and don't go in blind to any of this. Back to business. I will outline our subgenre constraints for the listeners in just a moment. But before we get into that, let's start with our experiences in extreme horror. So what have your experiences been with consuming this subgenre, and what is the most extreme horror film you've ever seen and why? And Suzie, I want you to start us off.
All right, so we're going back into the days of AOL Instant Messenger. I think I was in a chat room. I was in high school. I was babysitting, probably not doing the best job. And I think I followed a bunch of links, and it took me to watching Faces of Death. And I was totally convinced that was real. Up until a few days ago, I still thought it was real, but apparently it's all manufactured with some real stock footage, but largely made up. I still regret clicking on that link because that gave me nightmares for years. But then in my 20s, I went back for more. There was this little comic shop called Sarge's Comics, and it was about a half an hour from my house. You could get anything you wanted on DVD, and they were burned copies in pretty convincing DVD cases with cover art. But I think it was 2005 or 2006, I bought High Tension, and from there I went deep into French Extremities. But I would say the most unforgettable and indelible movie that I cannot erase from my brain would be a Serbian film. And now I really need to prepare myself if I'm watching any kind of extreme body horror anymore. So I tend to stay away from this topic that we're discussing tonight. But I did a few watches just to have something to talk about. Oh, and I also watched The Sadness, and the first time I watched it, I turned it off after 30 minutes because I just couldn't handle it. But I watched it till the end for tonight. So that's my history. What about you, Jay?
Let's see. I really kind of did a deep dive into it somewhere around 2010, 2011 when I started horror podcasting. Because I think way back on my first podcast ever, I did an extreme horror type episode. And so that's when I really started watching all the quote unquote classics, for lack of a better word. But I think the one that sticks with me the most, that I just totally kind of did me in. And it's weird. Just one quick thing. It's weird to pick a most extreme, at least for me, because there's so many that are extreme in different ways. But this one just sticks with me. It's called Man Behind the Sun from 1988. And it's a film from Hong Kong. And it's about Japanese troops. They round up Chinese and Russian prisoners, and they're prisoners of war. And they do all sorts of torture and experiments on them, and test biological weapons. And it's extremely grotesque and upsetting and just soul crushing. So, yeah, that I guess that would be my answer.
So, Suzie, you already mentioned the sadness, which is going to come up a couple times in this episode, but I'm pretty public about my distaste for anything that starts to border exploitation, which often dips into extreme horror. So I would say my biggest thing with this subgenre is that it's really hard for me to stomach anything with sexual violence in film or any media, really. So all of these things considered, I'm definitely not the target audience for extreme horror. Going back to the sadness, that's definitely my most extreme watch. And I think what made it so extreme for me was just how unabashed and unrelenting the sexual violence was in that film. I found it to be just honestly disgusting that it just even exists. And the fact that someone could write and script this shit and not see an issue with it is just something else. But in the director's defense, this is based on a graphic novel, so someone else had thought of it. He just put it on the screen. And I can handle blood and guts and people getting bisected and dissected and all of that, but that's a really hard line for me in terms of sexual violence. And it just takes me out of the viewing experience and takes away any of the fun for me. It also makes me think about whether or not this is kind of making a mockery of real life sexual violence, which again is something that is an actual thing that happens, and we have it used as not even a plot tool, it's just used as for shock value. So those are my opening thoughts on the genre. I'm hoping we can outline a few key definitions because we've already used a couple, buzzwords here: extreme, exploitation. So let's get some definitions here to help us chart through the waters. The first is extreme cinema. So the publication Extreme Cinema from the Edinburgh Press defines extreme cinema as the highly stylized treatment of sex and violence in a post-transnational cinema, where the governing convention is not the narrative, but the spectacle, and the mode of cinema dwells instead on the exhibition of intense violence and the acute intimacy of the sexual body, including jarring editing, extreme close-ups, visual disorientations, and sounds. And some prominent examples include Cannibal Holocaust and Hostel. So that's our first one, extreme cinema. Now, something that will come up a couple times in the conversation is new extreme cinema, or new French extremity, which describes a range of transgressive films around the 21st century that caused a lot of controversy in the film community. The initial films of this wave were made by French artists, but now it's grown to include films that just mimic the same storytelling style. So they were notable for being very graphic for violence, especially sexual violence and rape, with explicit sexual imagery. And two examples are a Serbian film, which we mentioned earlier, and Raw from 2016. And then finally, my personal favorite of this conversation, which is exploitation films. So exploitation is a film that tries to succeed financially by exploiting current trends, niche genres, or just outrageous content. These often include themes like, again, sexual violence, sensational violence, drug use, gore, destruction, mayhem, all of that. Some notable facets include rape and revenge films, slasher films, and splatter films. And some examples include I Spit on Your Grave and Last House on the Left. And together, these three terms have been colloquially referred to as torture porn in modern film criticism. Jay, start us off. Coming into this conversation, do you think, were these definitions kind of in your mind? Do you think they captured what you were drawing in terms of lines of the subgenre?
Yeah, I think those are really good definitions. And if I may, I like to look at this in terms of like there's kind of like a hierarchy. Okay, so we know from, I think it's all the way back, Socrates or Aristotle. One of those said that drama is conflict. Okay, and then if you take that up to the next level, extreme conflict, like a stronger conflict that you might not encounter in your everyday life. Extreme conflict is horror, and to me that's like you might have an argument with someone at the grocery store, but typically someone doesn't, pull out a meat cleaver and start hacking on you, okay? And then the next step up from that is extreme horror becomes what we're talking about here. So it goes from drama is conflict, and then extreme conflict is horror, and then extreme horror is the kind of depravity that we're talking about here. And the last thing I'll just say about this is the difference between horror and extreme horror cinema. I think there is a distinction, and the best way to understand it, and I'm not trying to sound like a perv, but I mean, is the difference kind of between softcore porn and hardcore porn, which in softcore porn, you don't get as much like graphic depiction of the actual interaction of genitalia, whereas hardcore porn puts that right up in your face with genitals and so forth. And so that's kind of the distinction that I see between horror and extreme horror. So I'll leave that there until you're ready for exploitation, but I just thought I'd throw those out there.
I didn't know we were going to end up here, but here we are. Suzie, what makes something extreme for you?
For me, I think of extremes when the entire film is focusing on something extreme in nature, like rape or torture. I mean, there's so many horror films that include violating women as part of the storyline, but the movies that really go into it and make it the center of the storyline are pretty extreme to me. I mean, the first movie that comes to mind is Irreversible from 2002. And I mean, yes. Jay, even your bud, Roger Ebert, said that it was a film so violent and cruel, it would be unwatchable to most. But that movie was praised by the Cannes Film Festival, and it even won an award at the Stockholm International Film Festival. So this conversation has me thinking about how some regions can consider something of such graphic nature artistic, while other places it's viewed as disgusting and exploitative. So I think it's fascinating where you live and how you were raised has a direct impact on how you view a film, especially the films we're going to be talking about tonight.
Jay, talk about exploitation films for me. So tell me, where do you see the difference between extreme and exploitation? Because for me, these often feel like the same thing, but I feel like exploitation, especially in terms of film history over time, has changed a lot. Like we'll see, Night of the Living Dead was considered an exploitation film because it had at the time outrageous score for the time, and it had a racial undertone to it, and it had this like anti-government spin. So that was considered an exploitation film at the time. But if you stack it against something nowadays, that is so tame. So tell me what you're thinking.
Yeah, I agree, Lonely, with what you said there. I think it has definitely changed over time, and especially in the 60s and 70s. I mean, exploitation cinema became sort of this midnight drive-in way to sell movies to teenagers. I mean, a lot of times they would have an exploitation poster, and what is represented in the film isn't nearly as egregious or scandalous as what's depicted on the poster. But so I do think of it often in those terms. But, something I want to say about the critique of exploitation is I think that as with horror, and we probably will end up into this debate maybe a little later, but as with horror, I mean, the very purpose of that style of filmmaking, the very purpose is stated within it, which is to exploits. And so I do think there are types of exploitation films that I've encountered that were exploitative, but they weren't necessarily to put butts in seats and just use a scandalous poster. Like, for example, there's a documentary from 2006 called The Bridge. It was directed by Eric Steele. It's one of the most remarkable films I've ever seen. And in essence, in 2004, they filmed the Golden Gate Bridge the entire year. And of the 24 jumpers who committed suicide off the Golden Gate Bridge, they captured 23 of them on film. And so watching this film, and it actually shows these people jump to their death, and it's very upsetting and troubling, and it makes your blood turn cold. And I'm watching this film, and I'm thinking, this is so exploitative and tasteless. Like, how is this guy how does he sleep at night? But in the film, he I feel, this could be wrong, he shoehorns in this agenda where he wants to talk to the families of those who jumped and try to understand more about suicide. And so that is given some lip service. It does occur in the film, but honest to goodness, in my opinion, I still think that The Bridge is an exploitation film, but it's not in the same way that, we typically think.
Yeah, that made me nauseous just thinking about that. So, Suzie, take us through our game, because we are blurring the lines here a little bit. So let's reorient our compass.
Do you want to play a game? This is where you say yes. Okay.
Yes.
So we're going to give you a film and ask you if it's extreme horror, and it's just a quick yes or no with no explanation.
Okay. Just so I'm not determining whether it's horror or exploitation. It's just, is it extreme horror? Right?
What do you think, Lonely? Just extreme?
Yeah, just extreme. We can't give Jay that much of a soapbox.
Okay. Okay, here it goes. Ready.
Terrifier.
Extreme.
Audition.
Extreme.
The Strangers.
Not. Just horror.
Evil Dead Rise.
Just horror.
The Saw franchise.
Oh.
Yes or no?
Yes. I'll call it extreme.
The Hills Have Eyes.
Yes.
Texas Chainsaw Massacre.
No.
Maniac.
Yes.
Videodrome.
It's been so long since I've seen that. I don't remember much about it, to be honest.
That's fine. You can say pass.
Pass. Sorry.
Turistas.
Oh, I love it. No.
Clockwork Orange.
Yes.
Rob Zombie's Halloween.
Yes.
A Classic Horror Story.
No.
All right. Well, there's no win or lose, so thank you.
Is there?
That was fun. I loved it. I loved those. You threw some curveballs at me there.
But that was the point of that.
Yeah.
You mentioned a lot of these that I thought were extreme were just horror films. So I think that brings us into the topic where we're looking at the historical lens and how the term extreme has changed. And you were mentioning that earlier. I feel like now we're getting exploitative horror coming into the mainstream and being consumed by the average moviegoer rather than smaller niche audiences that used to seek out the subgenre. Everything's getting more extreme. You were talking about Night of the Living Dead, and now we have that against Terrifier. Those are two very different things. I was watching a documentary, Birth of the Living Dead. Have you seen that?
Yes.
Yes,
That's
so good.
Wonderful documentary. And they were describing Night of the Living Dead as an extreme horror film. You had to look at other films at the time. So at that time, I think it was like a lot of Vincent Price films where you could take children to. And then all of a sudden, Night of the Living Dead comes out, and all of these younger children are going to the movie theater because they thought, oh, it's just another horror film. But I'm going to bring it back to Roger Ebert. When he went to go and review this movie, it was selected by the National Association of Theater Owners as Exploitation Picture of the Month. And this was something new and bold. So in the movie, there's little girls killing their mothers and people eating flesh, and even the hero dies. Robert Ebert didn't even rate this movie. I think his experience with this exploitative horror movie really got to him. I have a quote for him. He said, "This movie stopped being delightfully scary about halfway through and had become unexpectedly terrifying." So just his reaction to the audience's reaction makes me think that Night of the Living Dead is when exploitative horror takes off. And now here we are with Terrifier, two completely different movies, but affecting audiences similarly. I always wonder about the children I see in the movies like these. Mm-hmm. And just, I think children were scarred from Night of the Living Dead because they did not know what they were going to get. But now I go to these movies and I see toddlers. I saw toddlers in Evil Dead Rise because the parents wanted to go see it.
Same. Yep. Yes.
So it's becoming so pervasive. It's pervasive in the horror genre. It's disgusting, and I think it's something that's hard to avoid.
Suzie, I love that you cited that. That's one of my favorite things that Roger Ebert's ever written. And in fact, I was just recently quoting that over on Day of the Dead's New Horror Movies. But I love at the end how he says, I saw children, something to the effect, he says something like, I saw children who had fear to the extent that they did not know how to handle it or cope with their feelings. That was just so...
Leaving the theater crying.
Yeah, so upsetting. But yeah, that's a great quote there. Thank you.
And then we have children leaving these extreme horror movies with their parents, laughing.
Yeah. I just saw Insidious the Red Door, and even though that is so far from extreme, but we saw a couple walk in with a toddler. We looked at each other like, what? I could never. So we talked a little bit about ethics already. So I guess three of us are at least on the same page where there's something ethically wrong with bringing your child to a horror film of this nature in the theater, especially when you haven't seen it and can't say for a fact that you feel comfortable with your child consuming this. But anyway, conversation for another day. This begs the question about whether or not there is something ethically or morally wrong with making or consuming extreme horror. So is there something ethical about making something like this, writing and producing and displaying it? And is there something ethical about consuming it? Are there things that shouldn't be made? So Jay, I'm going to have you start us off.
I love this. So I think that, well, coming from an American perspective, I mean, I believe in the First Amendment, the freedom of expression and artistic freedom and so forth. I do. I believe in all that stuff. And I do think that an artist has, I guess, in any degree, I don't know how you would describe it outside of just using more morality, but a responsibility to at least look in the face of what am I releasing into my society, right? and speaking of Roger Ebert, there's a very famous, if people are interested in reading up on this, there's a very famous debate that he has with the filmmakers of a movie called Chaos from 2005. That's not the one that stars Jason Statham. It's a different film, and it is extreme horror cinema. And he gets kind of in a back and forth battle with those filmmakers because it is so nihilistic and dark and upsetting. And basically Ebert's trying to say, well, what is the point of this? What were you trying to accomplish with this? And that's kind of a neat debate. But anyways, I do feel like I do kind of believe in karma to some extent. And I think that what you do put out into the world can come back at you. And so there's that consideration. But I'll give you the perfect example. So for me, it's like, okay, yeah, an artist can make whatever an artist wants to make. That's fine. But as long as it's abiding by the laws of the land, that's my, if you can't make you shouldn't make a snuff film where you're actually killing someone or assaulting someone. You can't make a pedophile film where you're actually harming a child, of course, right? So that's definitely the line. But otherwise, to me, we're leaving it to, the marketplace. Basically, it's like, okay, if you want to invest your money and make that thing, we'll just see if it sells or not. But I'll give you an example. Sorry, I'm kind of all over the place. As far as films that shouldn't be made, there's a special example of another documentary. It's from 2012, and it's not a horror film per se, but it's one of the most horrific things I've ever seen. It's called The Act of Killing. I don't know if you saw that, but I consider that a straight up immoral film. And what it is these former Indonesian death squad leaders, they were ones responsible for this genocide. And so they were given audience here. The filmmakers contacted them and had these people actually reenact and explain their mass killings using whichever cinematic genre they wanted to, whether it was classic Hollywood, crime scenarios, musical numbers. And to me, I'm just so flabbergasted, because I reviewed this on a Movie Podcast Weekly with my co-hosts over there, and they all were totally against me on this. And I'm like, guys, this film is an atrocity. This is an immoral film. I'm not saying this artist shouldn't be allowed to make this because, freedom of expression and so forth. But it's just like Dr. Ian Malcolm says, just because you can doesn't mean you should, right? And the fact that it's like, why would you give these literal killers, genocidal killers, why would you give them an audience where they can relive all this and even make light of it by dressing up and doing these silly things? Anyways, it was just so offensive to me and so upsetting. So yeah, in that case, I think that's an immoral film. I think that's wrong, but I wouldn't personally try to outlaw somebody from that, because I do believe in freedom of expression.
Well, I'm glad I'm going after Suzie. So Suzie, you're up.
I think Jay pretty much covered all of it, but I think it comes down to what you want to consume, and you are the person who's making that your own decision. You also have to take into account cultural norms. Like I was talking about earlier, different people may have different thresholds for what they find acceptable or unacceptable. For me, I'm a firm no when it comes to non-consensual acts or animal cruelty. Those are never okay, not even for the sake of art, like Jay was saying. Some will argue that these films are a form of artistic expression, allowing filmmakers to explore taboo subjects, but I think that's complete bullshit. I think a lot of these films were made just to make money off the shock value and to push boundaries. I have a huge problem with Cannibal Holocaust just because of that one scene where they actually kill the animal.
Yep.
It's disgusting, and I've watched that movie because I feel like that is like a rite of passage in the horror community to watch Cannibal Holocaust, but I will never watch anything like that again.
I think this is where I'm glad I'm rounding us off, because I probably have the most drastic of the three takes, and where our generation gap is going to show a smidge. So I know that the points that are going to come up, which have already been brought up, is that horror is art and art is subjective. And who are we to say what art people can and can't create? And sure, theoretically, that makes perfect sense. But in practice, not so much, at least for me. So finding art in violence, especially beyond a storytelling measure, is depraved. There's no other way beyond that. And that's the key difference. If we go back to the definitions from earlier in the discussion, between a standard horror film and an extreme one is narrative. Violence in the standard horror film is used to move the narrative forward. It's used as a storytelling device. Violence in an extreme horror film is used for the sake of violence and for the sake of shock value. And I know these sound like straw man arguments, because we are literally talking about a genre that is built on the 80s slasher, which is just blood and boobs. But I really think there's a difference between violence in something like the original Halloween and violence in something like the Poughkeepsie tapes, which would be a pretty stark difference between standard horror and extreme.
Lonely, may I ask you a question about that, though? Mm-hmm. If I may. So I'm loving everything you just said, but it's something I was thinking about today as I was preparing for this discussion is, if we actually witnessed in real life a real Michael Myers stabbing someone, like if we saw this happen and someone was actually murdered before our eyes, that would be extreme. I mean, it would be severe and very upsetting. So I'm just, I guess I don't know what to do with that, I guess. And I was just going to ask you, what do you do with that? Because I agree with what you're saying. The distinction between how mild Halloween 1978 seems when you hold it up against something like the Poughkeepsie tapes, but what we're actually seeing represented in Halloween 1978 is an atrocity as well.
Okay, that's the question. I'm not being a smart ass.
No, yeah, I know I didn't ask it well, but I mean, how do you feel about that? What do you think?
Yeah, so I think what I would take it back to is, the subgenre constraints and the definitions we're working with, which is if we're looking at, if we were to put anything on paper, and that goes back to some things being subjective. Mm-hmm. If you talk to somebody like me, who I'm petrified of the dark, I sleep with a nightlight. So simply losing power is a mortifying event for me. So that is, I feel like real life events within a reason can be placed on a spectrum. But when talking about these things in terms of art pieces, thinking about them as films and not comparing them to real life in that way, not comparing them side by side, if that makes sense. So I wouldn't say that witnessing anything that would happen in a horror film in real life is equal to watching it in a film, understanding that it is not real. I wouldn't put those two things side by side personally. And that's why I can make that distinction.
Okay.
But there's a conversation that art imitates life and all that stuff, but
and one other thing then, just a little follow up and then I'll shut up, is that it does make me side eye people when they say things like, oh, I don't care if the killer hacks up 20 people. I don't care as long as the dog doesn't die. And it's like, are you kidding me? Yeah, I care about dogs too, but you got to realize that's also an atrocity if people are being murdered in the horror film as well. It strikes me as funny when people are like, as long as you don't kill the dog, it doesn't upset me.
Yeah, that's actually why in my reviews I tag animal death in my content warnings so people know if the dog dies. Yeah. But we're getting to a really interesting point here, which is how do you talk ethically about a genre that is in some ways not ethical in a lot of people's eyes? You know what I mean? It's like lining up a bunch of people who've stolen things and tried to say okay, well, you're more of a criminal because you stole more things, or you stole this thing and not that thing. And it's hard to that's why there's no right answers in this conversation.
Well, that's why I think you two, your show here is so fascinating to me, at least from what I've heard in episode 1 and so far in this episode. If you two continue to approach horror discussions in such a fascinating and interesting way like this, I think this show is just extremely interesting and intriguing because, you and I have talked about this before, which is critiquing horror films for being quote unquote offensive, because to me, that's like going swimming and then complaining that you got wet. It's like, well, a horror film is by definition transgressive, grotesque, upsetting, offensive, fear-inducing, so forth. So that's something that I'm so interested in hearing you all, the two of you, with all your future guests, continue to hash out on here.
Well, this kind of goes in line with what I'm going to bring us back to, which is this idea of censorship and whether or not we want to, who do we invite to the table and why? But anyway, speaking of the Poughkeepsie tapes, let's talk a little bit about censorship. So solely from an artistic lens, not a political lens. So I know censorship is also a political ideal, but we're not going to be unbunking that. That's a different podcast that we do not run on this show.
Right.
So I know that's a blurry line to draw, but let's do the best we can. So do you think there is any merit in banning horror films that are deemed too extreme by media governing bodies? So thinking about the motion picture associations, again, not thinking about the government, thinking about people who regulate films. So for some examples, the Poughkeepsie tapes was delayed being released for 7 years due to its content. I Spit on Your Grave is still banned in Ireland, especially. Again, our friend Roger Ebert really is getting some airtime today. But his comments on I Spit on Your Grave, calling it so sick that he could barely believe it existed, and called it a film without a shred of artistic distinction. And possibly the most infamous, there are several versions of the Serbian film, and the ones that we can find in the US are still drastically cut down from the original version. Thoughts on censorship? And Suzie, I'll kick it over to you.
Well, I got a pretty uncut version of the Serbian film from Sarge's comics, so let's talk about it. That film was described as a reflection of the darker aspects of human nature, or it's meant to be a cathartic release for viewers. It's also been argued that the people of Serbia see horrors every day, and this is a commentary on that, of their social and political, cultural issues and their dark, violent history. But I don't get it. Why do you want to make a film so extreme to try to accomplish that and tell a narrative that doesn't really explain that? How horrible is it to live a life that these people live every day and not explain that directly through the film, but create a film that's just so horrid and disgusting and then say, oh, we made it because this is just what the people in Serbia see every day, but in a symbolic way. As for the censorship, I don't think that film shouldn't have been made. Who gets to draw that line? I say don't censor anything. I mean, that's a discussion about freedom and expression. But you also have to think about the harm it could cause to the audience and if it was viewed by the wrong people. So I don't like the idea of glorifying violence, which I think that film did, like literal violence and sexual violence. But I also don't think it's anybody's right to censor it unless, of course, the violence is non-consensual. Oh, but I actually do think that parents should be the ones censoring things that their children are watching.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But yeah, the Serbian film, I don't think that film should have been made, but I decided to consume it, so that's on me.
Jay, you want to chime in here?
Yeah, absolutely. So I got some confessions to make here, and I'm going to reveal myself as a little bit of a hypocrite on the Nobody's Horror Podcast. So number one, you asked, one of your prep questions for me was, are there any extreme horror films that you will never watch? And a Serbian film is one of them. Now, I have not watched it, nor will I watch it. But I'm very familiar with what's in it because at one point I had a horror fan friend tell me just, point by point everything that was depicted in it. And I'm like, nope, that is not for me. Now, like Suzie was saying, I don't believe, again, that's artistic and assuming that which I'm pretty certain of this, assuming that the crimes depicted in that film were not real and actually happening, which so assuming that, because like I said, the law is my standard. If it breaks the laws of the land, right? But assuming that, then yeah, it's like if you want to make that, I guess. So I know I don't think it should be what's the word, censored. However, I will confess, when I see that film in the movie store, like if I'm at FYE and I see a Serbian film, I do, in a sense, unofficially censor it because I kick it under the shelf. Anyways, not much reaction from the hosts here. I'm sorry. But
we're navigating a little tech challenge in the background.
Oh, okay. I'm like,
listening.
I'm like, okay, well, they are looking down upon me for my hypocrisy. But I will say as well, I do want to put this out there. Like, being a film critic is very important to me, and I do not review or rate films that I have not seen, since I have never seen it. I won't give a rating or anything, obviously, but just knowing the content that is in it is why I refuse to see it.
So I just love when you take my agenda and just throw it out the window, Jay, because that was for a later segment. But thank you for volunteering and exposing yourself for not having watched the Serbian film. I have also not seen it. And I don't care how people feel about that. I don't want to watch it, but we'll talk more about Unwatchable in a bit.
Mm-hmm.
So
I wish I could erase everything I've seen. And I must have seen that film maybe 15 years ago. And it's still like fresh in my mind.
Well, and you can't unsee things is the problem.
No. Okay, so I have a question for you, Jay.
Mm-hmm.
Are you ready?
Yep.
All right. So I know that you are pretty deeply involved in your religious community.
Mm-hmm.
So how do you reconcile watching exploitative horror with your religious beliefs? Are there any aspects of exploitative horror you find challenging or conflicting with your faith? And lastly, have you found any strategies or guidelines that help you maintain a balance between your faith and the content you consume? I know it's a heavy question.
Love it.
But it's something I've always wondered about.
That is a brilliant question. I'm so impressed, and I'm really glad you asked it. And it used to be very awkward and uncomfortable for me to answer this, but I'll just put it out there now. I'm used to answering this question. So I belong to a Christian faith, and in my particular faith, I mean, it's pretty, it's pretty, what's the word? Nowadays, the word conservative is like a swear word for some reason, but it is very, it's very like traditional, so to speak. And so the leaders of my church actually encouraged everyone, and this is back in the 70s. No, it wasn't 70s. It would have been, yeah, it was 70s. It encouraged everyone to not watch rated R movies, just encouraged that we should not watch rated R movies. Well, I joined this church when I was 19 years old. And so I'm a convert, and I'm sorry, when I read these Skype comments in the background, I can't not respond to that. Anyways, these ladies are making fun of me. But anyways, no, I'm just kidding.
I'm not.
No, I know.
It's me. I'm making fun of you.
Yeah. Lonely's making fun of me. She's holding her breath. So when I joined this church and I found about the R-rated rule, the thing you got to understand is that I love movies. Aside from my kids, okay, I love movies more than anything on this earth. Aside from my kids, I mean, serious. I am a nut. I am a genuine cinephile. And so when I heard that, I'm pretty by the book, except I'm like, ugh. And then what I discovered is the things they ran down the list, the leaders of my faith ran down the list of things that we should avoid. And it's the quote unquote objectionable content, the things that would, garner an R rating. And then it got to the point where PG-13, many PG-13 movies have that same quote unquote objectionable content. So there were other members of my faith on their high horse about not watching rated R movies, and they watch all these PG-13 movies. And I'm like, hey, wait a second, you're still watching that content. So I flat out decided, because I went to college and graduated to become a film critic. That was what I wanted to do for my job before that actually went extinct in 2008. But I decided circa 2006, you know what? This is one that I'm just going to have to sort out on the other side with God. I mean, I just said a prayer and said, you know what, I got to watch rated R movies. I got to. I love movies so much, and I'll take my lickings or whatever I got to take on the other side. Whatever's coming to me basically is going to come to me. And I know that's not the most lofty or high-minded. And yes, my children are raised in my faith, and my son is following in my footsteps as a horror fan. And I do feel kind of bad about that on some level, but at the same time, it's like we do have the freedom to choose, and I'm making my decision. So long story short, it is, as they say, my favorite sin is watching. So yeah, I do feel bad. And I have had some, which we'll probably get to it, so I'll just save it. I've had some really jarring and earth-shattering kind of experiences watching some horror films that affected my faith, but maybe that'll come around in a minute.
But also, maybe it could be, I mean, I don't practice religion, but maybe it could also be a way to strengthen the values you do believe in. Yes, absolutely. In fact, I have a good buddy in the horror community, Pastor Matt Rawlings. He has his own fold. You know, he's the pastor of a church. He used to wear the horror movie podcast t-shirt while he was preaching sermons, which cracks me up. And yeah, Pastor Matt would always say that, hey, this is horror is about the difference between good and evil. You know, and the reason I watch horror, there are two reasons really that I watch horror, other than escapism. But number one is it makes me feel better about my own life. Because, you know, our lives can be mundane and disappointing. At least mine can be. And so I think that horror helps us cope with that disparity between what we could have been versus what we are. So that's one thing. And then the other thing is I love the cautionary tales. It helps me get in touch with the depths and dangers that are in this world that could threaten me and my kids. And when I watch horror, I feel like I'm brushing up on that. So I do feel like there are a number of moral reasons why I watch horror. Yes, I enjoy the boobs. Sorry. but I do feel like there are other high-minded reasons as well. I wish I paid more attention to the cautionary tales in horror. I've done a lot of stupid stuff. In every movie I watch, they would have been like, don't do that. And I'm like, well, I'm going to do it because I'll be the one that gets away. I was the one who got away.
You think you're final girl material, do you, Suzie? Are you the,
absolutely.
Are you the wholesome one among your friends? Just curious.
No, I'm not the wholesome one, but it's not always the wholesome one that becomes the final girl.
That's true.
I am definitely not. I have this conversation with myself every day. I say, you can't jump a fence. That's it. Zombie apocalypse. I'm take myself out.
I love it.
Oof. I'm not going to comment on anything Jay said because as an ex-Catholic, I'm feeling a little emotional. So I'm going to keep the agenda moving forward. Oof. All right. We'll talk offline about that one, Jay. I'm like, my blood pressure is so high right now. Anyway. So thank you for sharing that, though. I feel like it's such an interesting perspective, especially when we think about horror as a cultural element and thinking about what makes something scary to different people. Religion is such an interpersonal force along with all of this, and faith, the power of belief, all of it. So again, I'm getting like choked up for some reason. I don't know why this is happening.
Maybe we should bring Jay back in later on when we want to do religion and horror.
Love it.
And we can have Pastor Matt on here too.
Definitely. Yeah. I
need to get my fellow ex-Catholics in here. We need to get Don and Ellie on here so I'm not alone.
Yes.
I'll be the mediator.
All right. We've taken a turn. All this talk of what we can and can't watch, or what we should and shouldn't watch. And Jay, you started off the unwatchable lists already. So you talked about a Serbian film as being one of your unwatchable films. Is there another one that you wanted to share?
Yes, and that would be Salò, or the 120 Days of Sodom.
You took mine.
From 1975.
Mine too.
Yeah, the thing is, I haven't seen it, but I am very familiar with what's in it because I did a great deal of research, especially in 2010, 2011, when I was really deep diving into this stuff. And when I read the content that was in there, it's just that, you know, I just didn't want to see any of that. Now let me just make a distinction here so everybody can think I'm a genuine psycho. In Halloween Kills, for example, there's a scene where Michael Myers is walking through a house and there's a crying baby. Now, I didn't want this graphically depicted. I just wanted it suggested, but I wanted to see Michael Myers take out that crying baby, even though he doesn't usually do that. He only takes out people or things that are usually in his way, right? Now, I love kids so much, but to me, that's horror. And that would have been so freaky if he would have taken out that crying baby. And I thought the filmmakers were setting it up that he was going to do that. Having said that, it's just because it's scary to me. That's why. Well, Jay, why would you want that? Why would you want that? I don't want to see it depicted. I don't want to see violence toward children or babies depicted. But it would be done tastefully where he walks over to the crib and all of a sudden the crying stops and we know why. But having said that, I don't want to see not actual, but I don't want to see depictions of abuse or violence toward children or people, or especially where it pertains to grotesqueries and there's so much gross type content with Salo. Anyway, those are just, Salo and a Serbian film are just two things. It's like, I don't need that in my life. I don't need to see it.
Well, I feel like I've seen pretty much most of the extreme ones already. I will never watch a Serbian film again, and I'll also never watch Martyrs or Cannibal Holocaust. They're too much for me when I watch them, and they would definitely be too much for me now. I'll also never watch Megan is Missing again. But you asked about movies that I have never and will never watch. I have never and will never watch The Human Centipede. That is something I just do not need.
The first one?
I don't need more shit in my life.
Let me just, if I may.
Can we just acknowledge the buildup that Suzie needed for that bug fighter?
That was great. That was good stuff. That's so funny. That film is the first one. I'm not talking about 2 and 3, but the first one is surprisingly mild and tame. It's all in the mind. It really, the depictions in that are not what you're expecting. Just want to.
I'm almost dry heaving right now, though.
Yeah,
just poop no.
So. Jay took mine, but I was also going to say Salo. Mostly interesting segue on Salo. It was recommended to me by an older guy when I was a teenager. So looking back, this man was also very predatory in a way by recommending this to me.
Wow.
Yeah, no, it's a... won't unpack that today. But thank God I researched it before trying to find it somewhere. And I love how film buffs try to sing praises for this bullshit on how quality of political content this is, on fascism and authoritarianism. And this is basically the number one way to tell somebody you're sexually repressed without telling them you're sexually repressed, is by saying that you see any value in this film. It's actually based on source material by a historically proven rapist and sexual predator, Marquis de Sade. And do I need to see more? I mean, this film doesn't need to exist, and I believe the harm of it existing outweighs any benefit that it could potentially have. And my next one is August Underground. Any Ethel Cain fans listening? Do either of you listen to Ethel Cain? Oh, amazing. Well, stream Preacher's Daughter when you have a moment on Spotify. But the description of this film steered me away, and her most recent album has a track entitled August Underground, and it totally set me off for this film. So I would love to know what possesses somebody to make a fake snuff film. Like, I want to know what goes through your head when you're thinking about that. And put plainly, I know this movie would fuck me up, so I'm not watching it. This is the kind of stuff I have nightmares about already. So
I'd rather watch the Nicolas Cage movie. Is it the Nicolas Cage movie where he goes after the snuff filmmakers?
8 millimeter. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Watch that one instead.
Yeah.
Vigilante of exploitation horror. So now on to the extreme films that we have watched, for better or worse. So, Jay, what are some of the worst extreme horror films you've seen? And we think about this in quality, or wherever you want to take it.
Okay. This is a little bit of a cheat, but I promise this is going to do the trick here for you. Now, most people in the world would not consider this even a horror film, much less an extreme horror film. But I had to give this answer because of all the movies I've ever seen in my life, I have never had a more traumatic or dramatic, just visceral reaction. This film, it's a documentary. It's called Dear Zachary, A Letter to a Son About His Father, from 2008. And what it is, and I'm not going to spoil anything, but it's this filmmaker decides to memorialize his friend. His friend was murdered. And so when his murdered friend's ex-girlfriend says she's expecting a son, he decides to make this film about this kid's dad. So when the kid gets older, he can know who his dad was and what his dad was all about. But the thing is, this is an extremely messed up story. It's extremely upsetting. And I watched this and I was weeping uncontrollably, like to the point where, because I was sitting at my desk, my podcasting desk at my old house, and there was water from my tears all over the desk. And then the film goes farther. There are a few surprises in this. Have you two seen Dear Zachary by any chance?
No.
Yeah.
Oh.
Yeah. Okay. So you've seen it, Suzie. Okay. Yeah. And it goes farther. And I was so angry, like I almost got violent. And I'm not a violent person at all. I'm very passive. I almost got violent toward my furniture around me. I was just so outraged and upset by this film. It really messed me up. I've never been so affected by a film in my life. And yeah, and I don't want to spoil where it goes or anything, but I would have hunted down people related to this film, not the filmmakers, but people in the film, if it weren't not possible. So I'll leave it like that. But yeah, so that's going to be my answer. Dear Zachary, a letter to a son about his father. Do you think I'm a big sissy, Suzie?
No.
Okay.
No, you have to mention it's true. Did you mention it was true?
Yeah. Well, yeah, it's a documentary. True story. Actually happened.
Yeah.
So upsetting.
I know. Oh, the ending and the interviews with the parents.
Oh.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. But
yes. I'm getting mad right now.
I know. Me too.
Like mad as hell. Anyway, go ahead. Sorry.
No, it's okay. For me, I think I mentioned it already. Cannibal Holocaust, hands down. I actually thought it was a true found footage film, just like I did with Faces of Death. But that's not why it's my worst. It's problematic in the horror genre for several reasons. First, the exploitation of violence. It was unnecessary, and it wasn't actually driving the plot line. It's racially and culturally insensitive, and it perpetuates harmful stereotypes about Indigenous people, reinforcing racist attitudes. I hate that about that movie. And fun fact, the director faced legal charges due to the film's graphic violence. That movie is just unnecessary. I tell everybody to avoid it. Don't kill an animal. I know you have the argument about an animal versus a person, but
no, when I first saw that film, I'll just chime in on it. Because I love animals too, of course. I have a big soft heart, and when I saw that film, and especially the animal stuff, I just felt like, inside my soul there used to be a little candle, and it was lit. And then I watched that movie, and that little candle was blown out. It was gone. That film hurts. It does.
It does.
So since Jay was just so vulnerable, I'll admit on the podcast that I've never seen Cannibal Holocaust.
You don't need to.
No, I don't see it.
Well, it's just going to add to, and while I'm just adding the hate onto myself, I'll talk about my worst extreme horror film, which is Eden Lake. Oh boy, did I cause a spectacle on the internet with this one a couple months ago, but I did an in-depth review on this, and the review was pretty universally disliked. But in short, this is a political film, and it talks about the fear of societal decay and the failure of the government through the theme of broken Britain. And as a political piece, it's entirely tone deaf and just nauseatingly over the top, and essentially claims that systematic poverty breeds psychopaths and that abuse breeds psychopaths. And my master's is in public health. I don't like to toot my own horn about that, but I'm here to confirm with you that is not the case. That's not how the social determinants of health actually work. The social determinants of health actually lean towards the opposite, which is that impoverished people are usually more likely to be victims of violent crime. And this film is just too much. The septic tank scene, too much. The necklacing scene, too fucking much. So not a fan of Eden Lake, and nobody agrees with me on that. So that's my 2 cents there. And
just curious, did you end up watching Yellowstone?
No, I did not watch Yellowstone.
I know. I think I've asked you that before probably. But anyways, she has our main character there in Eden Lake has a very powerful position for the most part in Yellowstone. So maybe that could be cathartic for you. Maybe not. Anyways.
I think they killed a horse right in the first 10 minutes of that movie, and I just shut it off. Or the show, I just shut it off.
Well, but a lot of times horses are put down for humane reasons. But yeah, it's upsetting. Yes.
I thought there was going to be a lot of horse shooting, so I didn't watch it.
I love you, Suzie.
Okay, so on to the best. So the best extreme horror film you've seen, Jay.
Here's where I get kicked off the podcast. There are two. I have two, if I may, because they're both. They just when you ask, okay, the best. Okay, these two popped into my head immediately, and I'm like, I got to talk about these. Okay, so number one is a film that I love, very low budget from 2014. It's called Eat. It's written and directed by Jimmy Weber, and it's about this aspiring actress who is a victim of self-cannibalism, or auto-cannibalism. She eats her own body. So it's like an extreme version of pica. But who said they hated that movie? I'm reading the Skype comments here. Sorry. Lonely, you hate that movie? Eat? You saw it?
I do. I have seen it. Okay. And I don't like it. But continue.
Okay. So everybody was like so in love with that movie Raw, and it was good. But I'm like, Raw is nothing compared to Eat, So anyway, if you want an upsetting film, I'm just saying if you want an extreme upsetting film, Eat is pretty powerful because if you can imagine eating your own body. Now, here's what's weird about it, Suzie, because you haven't seen Eat, right, Suzie?
No, I haven't. Okay,
because here's what's weird. When it first opens, you're like, wow, this is low. Was this made for $10 with somebody's 1984 handheld video camera? It looks way low budget. But I will say all the budget goes into the effects of depicting her eating her own body, and it's pretty gruesome and bloody and gory. So I love Eat. And then the other one, this is a Spanish horror film. It is called Kidnapped. It's from 2010. And this is a hardcore, extreme home invasion film. And I'll just say to Lonely, I think that since Eden Lake upset you so much, I don't think you would appreciate this one. It's about these 3 criminals. They break into this home in Madrid, and they hold the family hostage. And it is brutal, absolute brutality. But for me, a 10 out of 10, because it is so scary as hell, and it could happen to you. I mean, this is like real life horror, and it is just a gut punch and a kick to the groin. So those are my two: Eat from 2014 and Kidnapped from 2010.
So I know, Suzie, technically you would go second, but I just have to go after Jay now. So for some, this might not be considered an extreme horror film, but I am going to go with Raw 2016. So I don't even want to talk now. Yeah, you're right. Yeah, kick Jay off the podcast.
Yeah, I knew it. I knew it.
So Raw was first screened at Canes. During that time, I was actually in my first semester of college, and I was on campus at a pretty notorious film school in Boston. I didn't study film. Nobody go there. I went for a communications program. But I vividly remember walking into the common room of my dorm and a group of film majors, sitting on the couch and saying that people fainted at the screening and how were they going to get their hands on this film? And oh my gosh. So I ended up watching it within the last year, and I thought it was gorgeous. And it had a really intellectual lens on the cannibal genre that we don't usually see. And it's female-led and has a really interesting take on femsexuality. And I thought it was fun, Jay.
Good. I like it too, by the way. I really do. I like it.
He just thinks Eat is better. And when you were talking about Eat, I don't know why, but the movie that came to my mind was the Lindsay Lohan movie, I Know Who Killed Me, when her leg falls off.
Oh, that movie's terrible. I saw that in the theater. So bad. There's another movie people might mix it up with, which I hope you don't. There's a movie that's so terrible. I'm sure you two would disapprove. It's called Feed from 2005, and it's a like a borderline horror movie, but it's basically about this unhealthy relationship, let's say, where the one person keeps feeding the other person and keeps feeding, and the only reason that sticks in my mind is because the woman who keeps eating and eating and eating, she calls the man who feeds her jelly baby. So I always want to call people my jelly baby. Anyways, that's all I have to say about that.
Oh, that's how you know we're getting to the end of the recording time here.
I'll round us out with best. And even though this is a movie I can never watch again, at the time I thought it was brilliant. It's Martyrs. It has amazing female performances. I think it's a feminist film, and it goes beyond the typical horror tropes and explores the theme of trauma and suffering. And I enjoy that theme in horror. It also captures the length that some people will go through to achieve enlightenment and transcendence. And I'm a big fan of cult horror movies. It's not just a gore fest. There's so many layers to it, but you feel what they feel when you're watching this movie. And I mean, this film has gained a huge cult following. And through my lens, I see Martyrs as a feminist film because it challenges traditional gender roles. I mean, 2 women on this film are badass. And I also have this as my best because it explores trauma and revenge. So have you seen this film, Lonely?
No, I've always kind of put off seeing it because I know there's sexual violence in it, so I've kind of put it off. But I almost watched it for this recording, but I ended up not watching it.
I don't think she'd like it, Suzie. Do you?
Maybe it doesn't take the revenge in the direction that you enjoy your revenge, Lonely. But I know you like feminist films, and I think this is a strong feminist film.
Mm-hmm.
I'll add it to the watch list.
I'd agree. Mm-hmm.
All right, so this brings us to my segment, which is deep cuts and lesser known extreme films that are worth watching, and you can take that how you will. I saw this movie like when I was in my Sarge's Comics days. It's called The Iron Man from 1989, Tetsuo. Have you seen that one?
Yes, awesome.
Okay, well, it's about a guy who transforms gradually into a metal person, a metal being. It almost has the same vibes as Crimes of the Future. Do you feel that?
Are you talking about the most recent?
The same, yes.
Cronenberg Crimes of the Future. Okay, yeah. Mm-hmm.
They're exploring the same themes. There's also Ichi the Killer from Japan in 2001, and this one's based on a manga series, and it's about a serial killer. Very well made. And Megan is Missing is a great cautionary tale about internet safety, but I'll just leave it at that.
Oh.
So those are some of the deeper cuts. Did you want to add any to that, Jay?
Well, I was just going to chime in there on Megan is Missing. I remember, people kept reacting that way to that one. And then when I finally saw it, I'm like, whoa. I mean, that thing packs a punch, honestly. Yeah.
A big punch, yeah.
The one, and I am a little hesitant out of respect for for the hosts of this show. I'm a little hesitant to give this one, but this is my little deep cut. Because listen, people, this is not... Let me just say, I got it, because Lonely is so moral, and you both have such great hearts that I feel like a jerk, putting out the movies that I love on here a little bit, because you're two just very good people with very good hearts. But if I may, the one I would recommend is one I always try to champion. It's called The Corpse of Anna Fritz from 2015.
Oh God, I knew you were going to bring that one.
But wait, it's not what it seems. It's a real surprise. At first you're going to be like, I'm going to kill Jay. He is the worst human being on earth. But I do think that it's there's something special about it, despite the sickeningness of it. So I guess I'll just leave it at that because I'm sure the hosts would not want me describing it even. So there you go.
Thank you for your contribution, Jay.
You're like, by the way, you're never coming back again on this show.
Literally texting Susie right now to cut that out. My one deep cut, because this is Susie's section, is Girl Next Door, 2007. So this is one that a lot of people would probably be surprised. I would recommend, and I wouldn't recommend it for somebody who does or is not able to consume sexual violence in film, because it is a critical part of the story and is based on a true crime film. But this movie and the book by Jack Ketchum quite literally changed my entire outlook on life. I never stopped thinking about this film after I saw it, probably because I saw it at like 13 and it traumatized me. That's probably what happened. But yeah, Girl Next Door, 2007 is mine. All right. We've made it. We've made it, y'all. We're at closing thoughts. What Jay doesn't know is we cut a whole section of the agenda off because we just want to get him off this show.
Yeah,
No, so this subgenre is raking in money. And there's also a fast-growing literary spin-off of this subgenre called splatterpunk. So between the films and the books, this is continuing to grow in popularity. And as it continues to grow in popularity, are we risking being desensitized to more and more violence? That is our closing question. And Jay, you can lead us off.
Oh, yeah, and I will not get into any sort of political angle on this. I'll just say that I am to the point now, if I go to the mall with my kids or any public place, I'm afraid. I'm afraid there's going to be a shooting in public and that I'm going to have to deal with that with my kids. And it's remarkable because I remember, here's the thing, I'm kind of an old man. I'm 47 years old.
No, you're not. Oh my goodness.
Yes, okay, I am. Okay. I'm 47, and and I remember, back in my day. But I mean, there were horrific things. But ever since, like, it really seemed like since Columbine in 1999, and then it just like the shootings, the mass shootings started going and going and going. And again, I won't go into any political stuff, I promise, because, you might be surprised on my feelings on that, but it's just the bottom line is it's extremely upsetting to me. I do think that we are, and we, meaning our culture, I think we are really desensitized to violence. And I've actually, like, for example, there were some foreign exchange students that I knew that came over here to visit and get schooling. And yeah, just talking to them, they can't believe just how cavalier and just how casual the violence is. And let me give you just one example, if I may, and I'm going to sound like a get off my lawn kind of old man. And I'm sure this game is super old by now and everybody's going to think this is stupid, but I saw my son wanted to play this video game, I think on his phone, called Kick the Buddy. Did you ever see that?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. Don't tell me you play that lonely. But anyway, no, I'm just kidding. But I'm like, man, there is something really wrong with our society when I saw that. Because Kick the Buddy, I first discovered that, I think, around the same time that I saw these news reports of like teenagers beating up homeless people, setting them on fire. And I'm like, there is something wrong. There is a sickness in our society. So anyways, yes, we are desensitized to violence and it concerns me greatly.
Okay, Suzie.
Oh, okay. Well, you pretty much said everything that I was thinking, Jay, but I'll just echo you when I think there's just so much violence around us that's almost more desensitizing than the movies we're watching. I think it's important to approach these kinds of films with caution and be mindful of yourself. I could watch them before. I cannot watch them now, and I cannot ever fathom watching any of these for enjoyment. But my real worry is the age at which children are beginning to watch these films. It's more and more prevalent that when I go to a horror movie in the movie theater, there are children at least 8 or 9 years old there with me. So I can't understand bringing a toddler there. I really can't. But at least they're not like really watching it. They're probably watching a phone or something. But 8 and 9 year olds, that's like when your mind is really forming and you're making connections with how you interact with the world. And I don't know, kids should not be watching these films. And you can find anything on the internet. So they're watching everything.
So similar to what you said, Suzie. So for me, 100%, we're becoming desensitized to violence, and not sound like some tinfoil hat anti-media boomer, but I really do think that the more extreme content we consume, especially without context or tools to separate it from reality, we become more desensitized to violence. And just like you said, I think this is especially problematic for teenagers who are now being introduced to horror as this new wave of intense gore and violence is at the forefront. So the introductory films of horror used to be Michael Myers in a closet with corn syrup, and now he's stabbing people's necks through a railing in slow motion. I mean, my little cousin is 13 and she just saw the new Scream movie in theaters. She actually follows our show too. So hi, Bella. Love you, Munchkin. She's going to hate me for saying that. But anyway, I know that movie would have been too much for me at her age. So I think in the coming years, it's going to be more important for people who play roles in introducing young people to the genre, whether it be siblings or parents or guardians or whatever, to do research and ensure that young people have the means to navigate this content and create separations between content and the real world.
Yeah, I mean, whatever happened to the never-ending story as the gateway to horror? Yeah.
Right, and that has a horse died in that one, and I had to stop watching it, Suzie.
Okay. Sorry.
We're in the home stretch.
All right. Well, Jay, thank you so much for being on the show with us. I guess when you can't find me hanging here with Lonely, I'm hanging with you over on Horror Movie Weekly. And I did not know that you are 47 years old. I cannot even call you my pod daddy anymore. You're my pod granddaddy.
That's right. Yes. Old school.
No.
Just turned 47. Crazy to me. Yes.
So, Jay, where can the people find you?
Yes, so thank you. And by the way, it was such an honor to be here. I am genuinely just so happy. I tell people this all the time. I don't think anybody believes me or cares, one or the other, but I rarely, it's maybe it's not surprising, but I rarely get invited to be a guest on other people's podcasts. So anytime I am invited, I'm like just so flattered and happy and giddy about it. So thank you for inviting me, and especially to be on a show like this where the conversation is just this is very smart and snappy, and I love it, and it was really fun. So thank you so much. I'm very proud of you too, and I love this show already. I'm over at Horror Movie Weekly with Suzie and our homeboy Mr. Watson, who is a real rabble rouser. Right? And then I'm also at Jay of the Dead's New Horror Movies. There are 9 hosts over there, and we have a good time. So thank you. If everybody wants to check it out, we'd love to have you.
So are you going to send Lonely a thank you card now in the mail?
I need to, right? Because she's so classy. I need to do that.
And you'll be judged harshly if you don't.
I know, right?
That leaves me. So you can find my horror reviews and rants for Lonely Souls over on Instagram at Lonely Horror Club. I try to post reviews at least once a week and try to cause problems in the Filmstagram community whenever possible. You can also find my writing on my website, www.lonelyhorrorclub.com. And can you believe it? We have made it. Thank you for tuning in to episode 4 of No Bodies. As always, sources, additional reading, and all of that fun stuff will be in our show notes. Please call us. We won't answer, but but you could leave a voicemail, which is half the fun. Give us a call at 617-431-4322, and we might just answer your message on the show. So friendly reminder to be nice, or it'll be exposed to literally the whole internet. Keep up with our antics on Instagram at Nobody's Horror Podcast. And last but not least, especially because we are a new show, we would love if you could like, subscribe, and leave a review wherever you get your podcasts.